Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Dorman, and we're glad to have you. Thank you for joining us in this version of IREI Live. As you may have heard, we're going to be recording this session, so if you have to check out and might miss a portion of it, don't worry. You can. We're going to be sending you a link, and you can check in and view it later, or you can share it with other people in your firm if you want. It's also going to be available to anybody that's registered but wasn't able to join us through the live broadcast. So as you know, our focus today is on the office sector. And as with all IREI live webinars, this is a sponsored program. So that means that the cost of producing the program and bringing it to you has been underwritten by our sponsors, who include Barings, Graciata Partners, JP Morgan Investment Management, MetLife Investment Management, Nuveen Real Estate, and Rockwood. So thank you, all of you, for underwriting and making this possible. Also keep in mind that while the program has been underwritten, our age-old no marketing policy holds. So if anybody starts to market, which I know none of our panelists will, but if they did, they'll be subject to the gong just as they would in any other program that we produce. But again, a huge thank you for our sponsors for underwriting and making this possible. Just to set the stage, all of you probably are more than aware that the future of office has been in question ever since the COVID lockdowns began over a year and a half ago. And it's interesting, I saw a little blurb today that said about 2/3 of office workers are uncertain about how and when they're going to return to work. And about 1/3 would prefer to continue to work from home after the lockdowns are lifted. That's kind of interesting. And according to our 2021 investor survey, on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most attractive, CBD office was rated 2.13 in attractiveness, and suburban office was rated 2.4 in attractiveness. And these are the lowest ratings that office has received in the history of the survey, stretching back 25 years. So the question is this a long-term trend or a temporary reaction to recent events? And the bigger questions are, what does the future of office look like moving forward? And more specifically, what do tenants want today? And which is going to be most attractive, CBD or suburban, primary gateway or secondary or tertiary markets, and traditional office formats are the recently emerging niche formats. So those are some of the questions that we're going to be exploring today, not the only ones. And to get the program kicked off and introduce the panelists, please allow me to introduce Chase McWhorter, our Managing Director for the Americas region. Excuse me, Loretta Clodfelter. I'm sorry, Loretta. I knew we were going to be doing this.
I will be playing the role of Chase on this video.
I was on autopilot. I apologize. I'm so used to introducing Chase. It's great to have you, Loretta. Loretta is the editor of Institutional Real Estate Americas and has been for quite some time. And she's been with us for many, many years. So she really knows the market. Welcome, Loretta.
Thank you. And I'd like to welcome panelists from our first panel to go ahead and turn on their video and sound so that they can join us. All right, and let's go around and do some quick introductions. This panel is What Does the Tenant of the Future Want? And I'm going to start off with some intros. Jonathan?
Hi, thanks for having me. Jonathan Ross. I run the international real estate strategy for Migdal Insurance Company. We're located in Tel Aviv, Israel.
And Doug?
It's Doug Schwartz. I'm the CIO of JP Morgan Asset Management Real Estate Americas. Thanks for having me.
And Tyson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me this morning. Tyson Skillings. I'm a managing partner at Rockwood.
Thank you. And as I said, what we're going to be talking about on this first panel is what does the tenant of the future want is sort of the question. And I think that's a little bit broad, but we are seeing some real trends that some of them may have started pre-pandemic, some of them are new from the pandemic. And I thought maybe we could kind of get into talking about what some of those trends are and what sort of things we're seeing. So maybe Tyson, I'm going to start things off with you, put you on the hot spot. What kind of physical environment and amenities trends are you seeing right now? And how do you think that's going to affect future demand and returns?
So maybe to kick it off, like when we look at the what tenants want kind of going forward, we got to break it down into the employer and the employee. And when we think of a company, right, on its simplest form, they're their charge is to maximize profit for stakeholders. And to do that, they need to attract and retain talent. And to do that, they need to focus on building a strong culture and a camaraderie and have space that facilitates collaboration, mentoring, career development, and advancement. And they want their space or their workspace environment to really embrace their culture. I think that was pre-pandemic. I don't think that's changed in a post-pandemic world. What has changed is the demands of the talent or of the employee. So obviously what we're talking about, we've seen all experienced the last, well, since I guess March of last year, is working from home, and how does that affect on a go-forward basis, as Jeff was kind of talking about in the intro. So tenants want more flexibility as they think about coming back to the office. They are concerned, or there's some anxiety about when and how they come back to the office. What we're seeing, Loretta, is as we talk to our tenant base, is a combination of, so we pulled our tenants, and roughly 65% say that they will be moving to a hybrid model, meaning they will have, and each one is different, but they will have a portion of their tenants who can work from home, others in the office, and some that are hybrid of both. So when we think about space needs going forward, you have the need for flexibility, and will facilitate some work from home, which could mean less space, but counter to that is you have employers thinking about, okay, a combination of we space and me space, meaning we space where they have part of their build out for collaboration when people are in the office, interaction, connection, but also the employees want a little bit more me space where the densification trend that was happening in the last cycle starts to reverse a little bit, where employees want to know that when they are in the office, they have some privacy, or they're not hot desking. So we're seeing a combination of both of those as we look forward, and that is going to affect the overall the physical environment as we think about space needs in a future sense.
I'm going to go over to you, Doug, as well. What's sort of your perspective on this question of sort of physical space needs, and are you seeing that same trend toward flexibility and de-densification?
Yes and no. I mean, I think I agree with everything Tyson laid out. I mean, the reasons people or firms need office space haven't really changed. It's coordinating projects, it's communicating, it's training, and then it's, generating new ideas and new business. And that's all done through the culture of the office, which I think is somewhat what Tyson's saying. I think that's all happened pre-COVID, and we saw more work from home, in the 20-year run up to COVID, right? I mean, office space per worker has shrunk 30% in the last 10, 15 years. So the companies are already good at managing flex and hybrid. I think one thing that COVID has revealed is some of the limitations of hybrid. I think we've all experienced how challenging it is to build consensus when you're not all in the same room. And what that means is growing your business, it gets a lot harder, and coming up with, getting new ideas adopted into the company becomes a lot harder. So I think there's somewhat of a reversion. While the force of work from home is going to continue, there's definitely a cultural countervail to that in realizing the limitations of work from home. And it's building consensus, it's the gaps in communication, and then frankly trust. I mean, anyone who's tried to negotiate with somebody, whether it's a lease or a purchase and sale agreement or whatever, all the things we do in our platforms by email, half of those fall apart. Whereas if you go meet face to face, or at the very least you pick up the phone, it's a lot more effective. And so that's never going to go away. We're humans. And so I think there's the move towards, the continued move towards hybrid, I think is going to get smarter over time based on the experiences, negative, particularly experiences we've had during COVID.
So with that sort of overlay, I'm going to go over to you, Jonathan. What are some of the things you're thinking about around these questions of how physical environment and amenities in particular might interact with demand from tenants and sort of future returns?
Well, we're all competing for tenancy, and that just becomes that much harder in a market affected by COVID. And pre-COVID, we were already focusing quite a bit on amenitizing all of our office buildings and making sure that there was plenty of amenitized space, whether it be, communal meeting rooms, open kind of cafeteria areas, other kind of collaborative spaces, and really kind of taking a lot of that burden off of employers. I mean, amenitized offices up until, a bunch of years ago was really the employer's burden. And now building owners are taking quite a bit of that on and using that to attract tenancy. And, we're out with a number of different operators and sponsors, and kind of across our portfolio, we're really putting an emphasis on providing additional amenitized space, providing boardrooms so businesses can plan without that big boardroom that's used 4 days a year in their office space, and really also supplying a lot of not just physical amenities, but also technological amenities. So we have apps that tenancy can use to find out what's going on in the building, and also social amenities. So we're offering, in a lot of cases, programming and wellness programming and social programming and happy hours and all sorts of things that make our buildings more attractive and enable us to much more effectively compete for tenancy.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those health and wellness trends. I don't know if a happy hour counts as a wellness trend, but it definitely is social. What kind of health and wellness trends are each of you seeing? I'll maybe start with Doug for this one.
Sure. I mean, I think all of them are the same trends as pre-COVID, with the exception of air circulation. I think that's the obvious one, and there's good technology there, and there's a lot of room for improvement, particularly in these older buildings. It's not all the buildings is it possible to do it, but I think the tenants are much more aware, and frankly, it's gross when you don't have when you're not moving air as quickly as you can, and so landlords need to be better about that element of the building. I think that also speaks to the benefits of new construction. I mean, there's just so much you can do with outside air in new construction that you can't do in the older buildings. So I think that's the biggest one.
Tyson?
Yeah, I think I agree with the new construction piece and hitting on that. When you look at health, wellness, sustainability, kind of the growing awareness around ESG, and really driven, if you think about it in our business over the last few decades, as of now, and especially with the kind of what's gone on with COVID, just heightened awareness of that by municipalities, by investors, and by the tenants. So you have these enormous driving factors. Our view is that doesn't go away. It probably that accelerates coming out. And when you think about it from US office inventory, a huge, enormous amount of that inventory was built in the 80s and 90s, and it's antiquated. And I think when we think about going forward and what tenants really want, when they think about the health and wellness and safety of their employees, it is tough to convert a lot of that old product, either due to physical constraints with window lines or ceiling heights, or just operations of the building. So from a health standpoint, whether it's smart tech building systems, Doug hit on air filtration, touchless controls, which we're seeing more and more, and we're putting in our buildings. On the wellness side, for us, that really spans into outdoor integration when we think about our buildings. How can we have indoor outdoor space, thoughtful access to open space or nature? Sounds soft, walkable amenities, but we think those aspects or those elements, kind of coming back to the amenity question, really helps drive long-term value for our assets, and really puts our tenants in a place to excel, and they'll pay for that in essence. And the sustainability piece really gets into just materials used. I think, with climate change, you've seen a lot of dedication, again, from governments, but from tenants, on making a difference. When you look at emissions, a large part of emissions come from the physical environment right now. So I think our buildings need to evolve and change over time. What that does for our industry, what it does for us as investors with tenants, is it really continues to bifurcate the office market into have and have not properties, where I think tenants will pay and look for a flight to quality and pay for that. And I think that the buildings that just can't meet the mark will languish a bit.
And Jonathan, where do you see health and wellness in the amenities side, sustainability as well? Questions around that.
Well, I mean, I'll start where Tyson left off, and so that these are things that are differentiators between the best in class buildings, which are going to be able to maintain tenancy and command, premium rental rates, and then all of the other buildings. So I would almost break it down into 3 levels, and I would start most micro, that where I was talking about amenitizing before, is that we're offering wellness classes and offering pieces of wellness education to the tenancy of our buildings. With regard to sustainability, kind of at the next level up, there's a definite demand and a trend, and it was, pre-COVID, but maybe accelerated now in our discussions with tenancy, that people are looking for air and light and outdoor space, because employers understand that those things create wellness, and wellness increases productivity and reduces sick days. So these are things that employers see and our tenants see as direct benefits. And the larger tenancy is clearly looking for these things because they have ESG mandates, and they have basic, there are prerequisites to tenancy. And if you want to be able to attract the largest tenants, your buildings have got to be hitting a lot of the buttons that they're looking for with regard to ESG compliance.
Yeah, Doug, do you see that happening as well, with sort of ESG as sort of a gatekeeping for tenants?
Yeah, I don't think you can separate this conversation from ESG. And as Tyson and Jonathan were talking about, I was thinking about one piece that's showing up a lot more on our new developments is stairwells, and stairwells going, creating individual entrances further up the building. So people, second, third, fourth floor don't need to get in an elevator. And that's a perfect integration of wellness and ESG and outside air and building identity, or I should say tenant suite identity, and creating your own culture. So, and that's one, it's sort of one of my pet projects, but we see it all the time. So I don't think you can separate them. Anything we're talking about with the tenant's experience in an office building after what's gone on with COVID is, absolutely a social, mandate for us building owners.
And I just want to remind the audience that we have a Q&A feature. So if you look at the bottom of the screen where it says Q&A, you can submit questions. And I'm going to ask my first question from the Q&A for our audience. This is the question: is anyone working on amenities including childcare, senior care, or after-school care? So when you think about that, do any of you have any thoughts on that topic?
We don't currently.
I would say, sorry, Doug, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, we have that tendency in several of our larger buildings or in buildings that are in larger submarkets. It's hard for a single building for that to be an amenity that makes sense. But if you can tap off other buildings, we have that tendency, and we look at it just the same as having a gym or a restaurant in your building. It's good for the tenants. It helps you get other tenants if you have them and in the ground floor, whether it's senior or childcare. So I would expect more of that. Yeah.
Tyson, I thought you were going to weigh in as well.
No, I actually agree with how Doug outlined. For us, it's probably, honestly, it's been more of a focus to date on childcare, but I agree that senior care, when we look at the aging demographic, is something that's really important.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of the design trends. Let's kind of get into the nitty gritty of the building. Are you seeing sort of different desires from tenants when it comes to floor plans, for instance? I've heard density come up a few times. Doug, what are you seeing around floor plan and tenant desire?
Well, I think that I do not think that this changes because of COVID. I think these are the trends that predated COVID, and it has to do with technology. So, for example, the quality of the glass today allows you to have a very different floor plate than from a heat load perspective than 30 years ago. And so I think you can do larger floor plates today and get more light in without sacrificing the efficiency, the heating and cooling efficiency of the building. So that just gets better every year, and it really makes the spaces easier to lay out. Also, technology, obviously, wireless, not having the cables and not having the furniture systems where you can just walk up and sit at a bench allows way more flexibility on the design of your office buildings. It, by the way, also makes older buildings a lot easier to program. So I think, that's one area where new doesn't always win, because you can adapt to, for example, a building that has, more columns than a new building might, and that's easier to handle today. So, but in general, it's open, collaborative space. That trend is, I think, here to stay. Larger conference rooms. I'm upset at our own JP Morgan group for continuing to shrink our conference room space. That's the one place where you really can, coordinate, collaborate, share information, is these big staff meetings. And I think tenants need it. If you can accomplish it with a co-working solution in your building, but if you can get one good meeting spot per floor, it's ideal. Those are some of the thoughts I have.
Jonathan?
Well, we work with a number of different people. Like I said, one of our sponsors is actively experimenting with different construction methods for facilitating flexibility. So maybe they'll need to plan in a certain way that's less dense immediately following the pandemic and during this time. And tenancy may want to kind of revert to what was that long-term trend where density came down from, 250 feet per employee to, right before COVID, we had people that were planning 90 to 100 feet, really dense desking per employee. Today, by the way, we have seen a number of different plans come in that have already gone back up to 130, 140 feet per employee. Planning meeting rooms that are kind of less traditional meeting rooms, sometimes with some couches in it and some different changes in collaborative space, a little bit more common space. And those are some of the physical changes in planning that we've seen.
Yeah, I've got some questions coming in from the audience that kind of impact that. So, what impact does the focus on collaborative spaces have on the square footage requirements of tenants? You were just sort of touching on that, but maybe Tyson, you could also or Doug weigh in on that question. do you find that collaborative space is upping the square footage requirements of tenants?
No, I mean, there's going to be an offset with more time outside the office. So I think it's neutral. I think there's collaborative space, and people are going to need to spread out a little more, but at the same time, you know, you don't have to be in 5 days a week. So now, one thing that our research team is focused on is while you may not need to be in 5 days a week, it's good for everybody to be in on the same day. So your peak usage is really what matters. So they kind of, you know, have to space plan for that. But that's going to change for different groups within a business. So I don't expect the density numbers to change that much. I think there's going to be, obviously CFOs are going to want to try to shrink their footprints, and team leaders are going to push back on that, trying to keep, you know, collaboration with their teams. And somewhere there's going to be a, you know, a middle ground. I think what we need to focus on as office building investors is, you know, what happens to overall office using job growth. And so, you know, which I think we're probably all quite bullish on, given, you know, the continuing trend towards technology. But that's a long way of saying I think that there's some reversion on density that Jonathan's saying, and then there'll be an offset to it. But all things, you know, all things poured into the same soup. I bet we don't have that much change in office takedown.
Tyson?
I think both Jonathan and Doug hit it. You know, when you look at the collaboration space, it's if you have people coming into the office at some working from home or a hybrid model, some coming in, some combination of both, you have collaboration space. It's almost less about that and more about how much private space do you need if people aren't, as Doug said, it's what's your peak capacity, and how are people coming in? What almost private space do they require or need? What social distancing do they need? That affects the overall square footage side.
On the topic of sort of private space, I have another question from the audience. Given the increase in Zoom meetings, especially in a hybrid work model, do you see this changing the open collaborative space model? Do you see people, I think the question is, will people need more enclosed offices than to handle the uptake in video meetings?
I think one reason why people like a little bit of the work from home is they actually have quiet space. And I think one thing that happened in this last cycle with the densification is at some point, and you know, you walk in and you see other people's offices, you have a bunch of people crammed in, everyone has headphones on, they're not collaborating. They're like, I need some level of peace and quiet. So yeah, I think that's part of the pushback that we see is people saying, yeah, you know what, there's a portion of my job where I can be more productive, where I have some peace and quiet. And so how do you bring that back? That's some of the change, I think, that dedensification of trying to be respectful of that as employers are thinking about their employees to give them that, a little bit of that freedom.
I can see it in our office. The highest population areas right now on the floor are the small conference rooms that handle 3 or 4 people with a video, because they're still talking to the 2 or 3 people that are still, you know, that are home or on the road or whatever. And we're much more comfortable with the video conference, although it's good to have a few people in the room, because, you know, then you get a different level of communication. So that is an impact. I think we'll see more kind of breakout room out of the space planning. I want to throw one comment in on Tyson's comment about, you know, people with their headphones. We used to laugh that some pre-COVID, somebody would say, God, I have so much work I got to get done. I'm going to need to work from home tomorrow. You know, it's like, so it's, you can be quite productive if you're just banging out work product,
right?
You know, then it works quite well.
So I have another question from the audience to bring in. given the structural changes in demand, and this is kind of what we've talked about, and possibly the increased obsolescence, which is I think another thing we've talked about, do you expect to see more conversions in the office segment? And that might be conversions of office product into something else.
Yeah, I think so. I think there are some submarkets that are really in trouble. And so in those areas where there's a, high concentration of traditional office users, professional services, insurance, that kind of stuff, and in these older buildings, that they're going to have to find a different use. Now, these are hard buildings to convert. I mean, so I'm not sure how much of an investment strategy there is out of that, but there are definitely going to be some big, some submarkets in a lot of trouble.
Everybody's functionally obsolete office building is a great life science play. I think I think that there is going to definitely be conversion, but there has to, in order for that to happen, there has to be capitulation, right? So an existing, someone who is the owner of that product has to realize either they have to have the means to convert it to a different use, or there has to be capitulation on price so you can buy it at a number that you can then convert it to adaptive reuse of something else, higher and better use.
Jonathan, any perspective on this?
Well, I think converting obsolete office into anything is a real challenge. And, certainly to life science, it's very hard to do it because best-in-class life science are built new because they have, higher ceiling heights and special adaptations for increased ventilation and increased electricity loads. And you can't convert an obsolete office building into that usage and have an attractive life science property, or to create residential property from an office building is very hard. What may happen in a lot of cases is that these things become priced and covered land plays, and you just take the whole thing down and then decide based on the specific submarket what the highest and best use of that land would be to build. And in some cases, it might be a best-in-class office building. In some place, it could be, some other type of property. But I think that the concept of converting obsolete office, I mean, it's something we would never take on.
And as I think Tyson also mentions, it's sort of a capitulation. Like they have to, the pricing has to be, you're really just buying the land in some of these cases.
Yeah, I mean, look at it wasn't office, but look what's happening to the Grand Hyatt. They're just, tearing the whole thing down, and they're going to be, because the land is worth so much money in that submarket, they're going to build, another mega, trophy tower in Midtown Manhattan, but not convert.
And we'll get into this a little bit more in some of the later panels. I want to touch on some of the questions that we're getting around COVID in particular, and how that's kind of impacting the office market. So, one question, the Delta variant, it's delayed the return to office for many businesses. What kind of office upgrades or amenities, what sort of changes have you found to be most beneficial at putting employees at ease? What kind of things help put people at ease to come back to the office, especially with the Delta variant back in play? And I'll let any of you kind of jump in on that one.
I'll say that I don't think there are lots of things the landlords are doing. I don't think any of it has an impact on whether or not the employee's coming back. I think it has more to do with whether the employer wants them back and whether they feel comfortable. And that's a personal decision that I don't think is too impacted by the moves that the landlord has made. And because the Delta, we just don't know. I mean, it's like bouncing around so much. I think it's just too early to try to grab any patterns. I mean, things to see, Texas seems to be, didn't go down as far and recovered much quicker. And, I'm sitting in San Francisco where it's still super quiet on the streets. And so there's no way to judge it yet.
I mean, I think just to add, I think part of this is it's maybe to answer the question as well. It's peace of mind and it with regards to communication between your management and your tenants, and that frequent communication. And what are you providing at the lobby level? If it's maybe a high-rise building, what are you doing to manage elevator vertical movement within the building? Obviously, we've talked about this over the past year and a half, cleaning protocols, but air filtration with MERV filters and what have you. So, I mean, to me, I think a lot of it is it's about communication with your tenant and then their communication with their employees, just to give a sense of that element of safety.
Specifically looking at that, I have another question. Are any of you seeing existing tenants or prospective tenants asking or focusing on indoor air quality? Are they asking in specific terms? Do they expect specific transparency regarding air quality? How detailed are the tenants or prospective tenants asking your air quality conversations to be?
I mean, I think it is on everybody's list of when they're asking that, typically not a question that if you went back 5 years, you would be getting, but I think now it is of mine. And now the question might be based on that answer, are tenants making a decision of yes or no? It's still pretty early on, i.e. to go to that building or not. I think that's very just dependent and it's nuanced.
Yeah, I think we're going to start seeing it more on requests for proposals to lease space, but there's been such a little amount of leasing activity. I mean, starting to pick up that it's hard to show a trend yet on that. Certainly on our new buildings, there's a lot of discussion about it, but we haven't seen that from existing tenants. So far as I know.
Let's talk a little bit about leasing trends. I know, Jonathan, we were chatting a little bit, and you mentioned you're seeing tenants looking for shorter lease terms as one of the trends in the market right now. Is the pandemic driving that, do you think, or is it something else?
Well, I think it comes from two different directions. First is, again, it's part of a longer term trend, and you see tenants pre-COVID, and I think pushed mostly by the shared office industry, has been driving down these terms because that's who we're competing with. And so pre-COVID, we saw lease terms already under pressure. Today, I think all of the uncertainty, and a lot of it is coming up in this conversation and all of the other conversations that I've had throughout the entire pandemic about, is work from home here to stay, or is it just a temporary trend? And all of the things that we spoke about in this conversation about planning, office density, and tenants are asking themselves, we understand that these are things that we have to do right now, but kind of what does that mean 2 to 3 years down the road, let alone 5 to 10 years down the road? So nobody is willing to commit, or they certainly don't want to commit to 5 and 10 year leases in space where all of these kind of very core questions are still very much uncertain. So we're getting a lot of requests based on that uncertainty for shorter term leases.
Yeah. Tyson or Doug?
Yeah, I think that flexibility in lease term is something that we're seeing right now. I don't think that necessarily goes away. I think with how people are viewing office space, and we can get into co-working or not, and how that affects the industry. But I do think, for us, one thing, especially with our smaller suites, if it's a multi-tenant building, we talk about fast, flexible, and fun. So fast meaning you want it built out in a very nice, clean, usable manner, so a tenant can come in and take it. Flexible, we need to be flexible with our lease term to work with them instead of always trying to shove, 5, 7, 10 years. Be willing on a portion of your building to with certain space to be able to be more flexible with your lease terms. And fun is just kind of comes back to that collaboration and connectivity that you create by being in the office.
I think there's two forces that certainly business cycles are getting shorter. I don't mean business cycles, but the growth trajectory of businesses is shorter. So they prefer to have generally shorter terms because they don't know what their life's going to be like in 3 years. And so they're pushing for that. At the same time, the way we finance office buildings has become a lot more efficient, and we don't really need these long-term leases in order to get the financing that we want. A lot of times the financing's done at the fund level or whatnot, and there's just not it's not as important for us to have long-term leases. So I think that happens on the one hand. On the other hand, a lot of it is just market driven. So if you're, for example, a life sciences tenant in San Francisco or Cambridge or San Diego today, you're going to try to tie up long-term space because if your lease expires and you have a risk of losing space that you can't produce, your business is toast. So I think it's so market driven as well. As long as there's slack in vacancy rates, people are going to go for a shorter term. But as soon as it becomes scarce, they're going to try to lock up for as long as they can.
Just looking, I'm getting a couple of questions looking at valuations. What kind of valuation impacts are you seeing, and are tenants willing to pay for these new demands? You know, is this gonna, you know, you mentioned a bifurcation as a panel. I think you guys have all sort of talked about the bifurcation in the office market. Are tenants willing to pay up as part of this bifurcation?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that first. The knowledge base. So we tend to go the way that we look at investing in office and what tenants we target is largely innovation, STEM, media tenants. And what we have found is that tenants are willing to pay up for that. We've talked about we've covered wellness, health, modern amenities. You know, if you look at the data, excuse me, the pre-COVID in 18 and 19, I think CoStar ranks their buildings, you know, 1 through 5, 4 and 5 being the highest quality. They had basically said in those 2 years, 93% of space absorbed was in 4 and 5 star product. And that accounted for 40% of total inventories. I mean, that kind of says in of itself that the tenants are desirous of modern, high quality product. And I think coming back to valuation, you're seeing that. It's whether it's in tenants willing to pay the rent for it, but also the capital markets rewarding that and looking to buy that on the takeout, if you will, of the back end of that. I think on the flip side, older product, we talked about the functional obsolescence, you know, product that has physical constraints or is in weaker locations. You know, I just think that there's limited pricing power both on the rent side and on the value side there.
I have another question. Go ahead.
I just extend that to, I 100% agree, and would extend it to submarket as well. So, you know, the technology submarkets in certain spots are rocking, and non-technology submarkets are dead. And the rents and the valuations are reflecting that divergence.
And so here's a question from Europe that it's a little bit long. So let's see if I can try and shorten it a little bit. But the question is that at least in Europe, valuation impacts on the office REITs space, which mainly hold the prime assets, they're seeing valuations actually continue to rise for these prime assets in Europe. Is this due to this bifurcation that you're talking about? Or do you think that prime might be affected eventually as demand could also dwindle in that space? And this is, I think, talking about Europe in particular, but I think we could also ask that question looking at the US as well.
Yeah, I think we've seen appreciation in the best assets in the best submarkets, and we've seen depreciation in weak assets and weak submarkets. And so, and that'll continue, because I think, and it all comes down to whether you're going to have pricing power to grow rents, and that's all about demand. So, so yeah, I think, if you just on balance, all assets in the last 18 months, outside of any other factors, have gotten more valuable, right? Because of the money supply. So certainly any assets where you're able to push rents will have gotten significantly more valuable, and any assets where you're going to have trouble pushing rents will depreciate.
I'm kind of building on that. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, first of all, we're invested both in the US and in Europe, and I can tell you that the European office market has been much more durable than the US office market has been through the pandemic, and pricing in the US was hit a little bit more than it was in Europe. But it's really still a tale of two cities, and all of these things tie into making sure that your building can compete for tenancy and push rent, because the good tenants and the high quality tenants will pay up for all of those premium features in the building, whether they're amenities or light or ESG or any of the things that we discussed today. And they're critical to putting together a winning strategy.
When you're analyzing properties, here's another question from the audience. How are your lease renewal assumptions trending compared to pre-COVID, post-COVID, and now maybe in sort of a hopefully, post-COVID subsiding? Are you, what sort of a lease and renewal assumptions are you working with right now? Are tenants renewing, or are they looking to sort of move to new space, and what kind of assumptions are you coming in? And maybe to fill that out, how has that changed across the pandemic? Jonathan, you look like you had a.
Yeah, we have a bit of a limited portfolio, maybe compared to the other panelists here, but we are finding that by and large, when there are renewals, they're coming with requests to downsize. I think part of that is due to the uncertainty in the pandemic, but in general, we don't see tenants leaving our properties, but we do see them renewing with a downsizing space.
Yeah, and I would just say it really just reflects the broader markets, right? So, I mean, we're in office space does not do well during recessions or in the years after a recession, right? It takes a while for the recovery to take hold. Now, this was a very fast recovery, so who knows? But in the markets where we have a lot of spikes in vacancy rates, it's the retention ratio is down, and we're giving more concessions on the renewals, or as Jonathan says, the tenants are shrinking. In the markets that have been resilient, we've seen more positive outcomes on renewals. So I think it's hard to generalize, but broadly speaking, the US office markets have gotten significantly weaker in the last 12 months. And so the renewal activity is weaker than it was, 2 years ago.
Tyson?
I think what Jonathan and Doug have outlined is, I'm not going to restate what they said. I think one thing that is, from a standpoint of where we sit today, if you look at office using job growth and compare that to the past two recessions, the GFC and the tech bust, both of those really gutted office job growth. And Doug was alluding to this, what you see now when you look at the data is it wasn't nearly as impacted during COVID. I mean, now you have people out of the office, but you still have office job growth, which definitely took a hit, but the recovery is looking to be much quicker than it has been in the last two cycles.
Yeah, some of these tech companies, the big ones, have hired thousands of people without leasing any space because they haven't had to lease the space yet. So when they start putting these teams back together physically, if they do, I mean, that's obviously still up to debate, there could be quite a bit of pent up demand in those particular submarkets. Yeah.
Continuing on that sort of work from home question, are any of these tenant CEOs sharing concerns related to cybersecurity or confidential information when it comes to work from home? And is that something that they're looking at, sort of more security in the office? And is that something that you're hearing questions around?
I have heard that from, anecdotes, but I have not heard any kind of C-suite tech company announcements about that impacting their space needs. So I do think it's a factor, but I'm just not sure how it fits in. I mean, if you have people working from home and the roommate comes over and looks at your screen, how's a company supposed to police against that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, I'm getting a number of questions about different markets, and that's going to be the big topic of the next panel. But if any of you want to just very quickly sort of throw out a specific market, one of the question is, where are you prioritizing for go forward capital allocations geographically and product type? And I think that'll be a good question for us to sort of use as we think about wrapping up this panel. Do you have any sort of key takeaways? And, as we wrap up, what do you think is at least one sort of most attractive office investment strategy, on a risk adjusted basis? And so I'll kind of go around with each of you and just kind of get your sort of final thoughts about what we've talked about with what tenants want, as well as, what you think is perhaps one strategy to highlight. And I'm going to start in the upper corner for me, which is Tyson.
Sure. So when it comes to office strategies, we think there's several strategies that will generate attractive risk-adjusted returns on a go-forward basis. To be quick, I think on the niche side, which we haven't really hit on, I know there's a panel for that later, but we like the strong long-term drivers behind life science and health right now, especially with the demographics of our country, and we think that has a lot of room to run. Very competitive, albeit, but I definitely think there's a lot of room for that to run. When it comes to office, we definitely favor a rifle shot approach and coming to markets. So market themes that really benefit from strong knowledge-based industries. One thing we spend a lot of time researching is the employment migration trends that have been going on, whether that is within metros, i.e. from a CBD to a strong urbanizing first-ring suburb, or across metros, which is some employment flight from gateway markets to key non-gateway markets. So I think that's something we spend a lot of time on. Location themes, which we hit on, that favor walkable amenities and attractive mixed-use settings, and then asset themes where we can buy, build, or renovate to really create that state-of-the-art product. We just believe that assets with those locations in those markets will continue to generate outsized returns on the go forward.
And Jonathan?
So we're actually fully allocated to office right now, so it's going to be theoretical, but were we to invest in more office right now, I really think that the focus on quality is key. And, the tale of two cities of the office sector, of there being winning buildings that are best in class, that offer all of the highest conditions of tenancy, are going to ultimately win. We believe in quality of the building, physically, that it needs to be located in major metros that have a large technology worker base, the highest quality tenants inside the buildings. Transportation linkage is always very, very key. And, these are typically more expensive office buildings, but for us, as a manager of retirement savings, we are very happy to give up 50 to 100 basis points of yield for a lot more security. So as a risk-adjusted return for us, those, especially in office, which has not really enjoyed the big cap rate compression that the multifamily and industrial sectors have experienced in the last period, office still offers attractive unlevered returns. And we think that going in, looking for quality and sacrificing a little bit of return is our chosen risk-adjusted play.
And Doug,
Yeah.
some key takeaways from today, and then maybe highlight a particular strategy.
Well, the takeaways are amenities, client experience, and a further bifurcation of quality, and as Jonathan says, quality and lack of quality, and it's going to continue and spread. What we're doing, I think our favorite office strategy continues to be, and this is what it has been pre-COVID as well, which is developing ground up, large floor plate, highly amenitized, office buildings in tech clusters. And so we're going to keep doing that. We've approved 3 more this year. So one was in Durham, one was in Nashville, and one was in Austin. And I think we're thinking about another one in Silicon Valley. So we're going to keep going with that strategy and following the strong clusters of growth.
I want to thank each of you for coming and joining us and talking about what it is that tenants want. I do want to say, yeah, we are seeing a certain themes that have come up so far. The bifurcation of office market, which I expect will be something that we'll dig into in the next 2 panels as well. Looking at the amenities in particular, it does sound like health and wellness are driving some of these amenities, as well as ESG being now sort of a crucial element of any office building. Or any thoughts about that? The challenges around obsolescence are something that I think we touched on pretty well here. We may get into that a little bit more today. And I look forward to hearing what all of you have to say in the future. And want to thank you again for joining us. And so thank you to Tyson, thank you to Doug, thank you to Jonathan. This has been our first panel. What does the tenants of the future want? And I'll ask you all to shut off your cameras and microphones and bring in our next panel.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And now we will jump into our second panel. This is CBD versus suburban office and primary versus secondary markets. I want to thank our panelists for joining us, and I will have them go around and give an introduction of each of themselves as we get started. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Gila.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gila Cohen. I'm the head of real estate and private equity at MUFG. We're a $3.3 trillion asset manager.
And Ryan. Oh, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Ryan Suela with Reseda Partners. We're a value add investor based in Northern California and focused on California's fastest growing region, the Central Valley, which is about the size and population of the state of Arizona. Given our secondary market location next to a primary market, today I plan on maybe providing a little more of a microeconomic tactical perspective on secondary versus primary markets, and hopefully that can be drawn to broader perspectives in other markets.
And I have Will.
Thanks, Loretta. Yeah, my name is Will Pattison. I lead the real estate research and strategy team at MetLife Investment Management. So a little different perspective from Ryan, in that we're thinking about all the markets, and I think it's good that Ryan's focused on an individual one, and we're investing in all the markets and all the property types in effect.
Yeah, I expect to have some real difference of opinions and conversations, given that all of you are kind of coming at this from different perspectives. Let's go ahead and start by talking about what are some of the office trends. office trends pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID. That's been sort of the theme so far today. We're kind of talking about what trends have been seen. We talked previously about what trends were shaping what tenants want in the office. Let's talk a little bit about what trends tenants want when it comes to location. So I'm going to start with you, Will, and maybe you can talk about what kind of trends you're seeing as we come through COVID on where office is most attractive for tenants, where they want to be.
Yeah, so, over the last 18 months, I think I did the math right there, since the pandemic began, there's certainly been outperformance in suburban areas and underperformance in CBDs or central business districts. Even just this year, according to NACREIF, I was just looking this up, the suburban unlevered returns have been around 4% or 8% on an annualized basis. And CBDs or downtown areas have been closer to 2% or about half that on an annualized basis. So CBDs have definitely been struggling. On the question of markets, we think about primary versus secondary and Sunbelt versus the Northeast or other areas. It's really hard to draw trends there because unlike in the past, the office using labor force has not, kind of the size of that group has not been the primary demand driver. And instead, it's really been work from home policies. The number one indicator of who's working from home, and this was something that I was pretty surprised to find when we were going through American Community Survey data, for any data nerds out there that would like to look at this as well. But the number one indicator has actually been the age and income level of the worker. And specifically, people in their 20s have been going to the office, people in their 50s and 60s have been going to the office, but 30s and 40s are staying home. And we don't have a great explanation for that or why that's the case. It could be related to childcare, but that kind of single indicator has been a pretty good sort of explanatory factor in the markets that have seen vacancy increases and have really seen underperformance in rent growth. And that's something that we're at least paying a lot of attention to when considering new investments.
Can I jump in and say that's the millennials right there? Make a little fun of millennials for the moment, because that's the group that wants to travel most during COVID and can't do Friday afternoon meetings because they're on a plane to Miami, and it's very difficult to work on Fridays and Mondays during COVID. So when you talk about the 50s and 60s and the 20s, and the middle group in between, I'm just going to make fun of them for a second. Hope no one's really offended, but that's been what we've seen when it came to that.
Yeah, really taking a spike to the people in their 30s and 40s. I'm gonna have to stand up for people in their 30s and 40s and say we're not just drinking martinis in Miami. I guess I'd be a mojito in Miami. I do think
to have a little fun here.
I do think Will's right though. Childcare is probably a big driver of this, and where you are in your career as well might be something that's driving this.
Certainly, I'd agree on the that 20-year-old group. We've all heard and talked about how you can come into a work environment and not have the mentorship, the camaraderie, the how do we do things, that sort of thing. Very challenging. So I'm not surprised that group shows up heavily.
Also, the 20-year-olds typically, if they're just starting, they might be with a roommate. We're in an incredibly small apartment, and it's better to work in an office, right? You have more room, you have the camaraderie. There's a lot more to it than just, than wanting to be at home as opposed to in the office. So I think there are a lot of factors that go into all of it. I think it's hard to generalize.
And with that though, it is hard to generalize, but we are going to talk a little bit about, market versus market. I'm going to go over to you, Ryan. Again, you have a very focused in perspective. Yeah, you got that micro perspective. What trends are you seeing in your sort of micro markets?
So just kind of touching on what Will touched on, suburban versus CBD, in our market, we really haven't seen just a huge shift one direction or the other in terms of preference for CBD versus suburban. Maybe call it 5-10% of the more CBD tenancies have looked to periphery markets, but I wouldn't say that that's a huge trend in our market. Generally, people are in CBDs because of what the CBDs offer. People who are in the suburban markets are in the suburban markets because of what the suburban markets offer. And so we just haven't seen a huge shift one way or the other there.
I'm going to go over to you, Keela. What's your perspective as an investor when you think about CBD versus suburban office and sort of tenant trends there?
We haven't seen a rush to suburbia for people, who have big offices in the city to start opening offices in the suburbs. We think people should be in the office with their team doing what they should do. And, we're going back to work, although we've pushed it off to December. If anybody's interested, we're waiting. We have 3,000 people strong in New York, and they're not going back to work till December. So it's definitely challenging times and hard to think about it. But we don't think that suburban office is a solution to getting people back to work. We actually think it's the same problem, just somewhere else. And we want people back in our main building, in our office, teams working together. So we don't think that that's necessarily a trend that, while some may do it, that is going to grow. I think at the end of the day, people want to be back in the office. We've talked about it all along. I think since the beginning of COVID, when we've talked about offices, people want to be back with their teams in the main office where the CEO sits, where there's talk around the water cooler, where there really is the opportunity to have those broad, thoughtful discussions that take a company forward, whatever industry they happen to be in. So we don't see suburban office as a huge trend, but happy to be wrong.
And I have a question from the audience, and I just want to remind people that we do have the Q&A feature if you'd like to submit a question. I have a question about talking about suburban office, the hub and spoke model. In probably the first few months of COVID, hub and spoke was raised as a possible approach. Has that panned out in the last, say, 12 months? And is that a trend that we expect to see going forward? I'm going to go to Will or Gila on this one.
I'm happy to start. I'd say no, not really, although it's still too early to know that. And I hate to say this, but it may be too early to know that a year from now as well. Companies don't really know what their long-term plans are. The hub and spoke model is, in effect, a thesis to invest in the suburbs. It probably is a little bit more applicable to lower cost office space if there's not a centralized location, and if tenants view the value of offices as being kind of a place where there's a distraction-free zone with a fast internet connection. My view is that probably will not take off too much, but I say that with sort of low conviction. And that's simply because of what was mentioned earlier, which is that I think one thing almost all of us have learned directly or indirectly during the pandemic is that the value of an office is not that internet connection or the distraction-free zone. It's collaboration, it's building down or breaking down silos and building trust with coworkers. So that's at least the tentative view. I'm hoping, as I say, that my internet connection doesn't break because I am working from home right now, but that's at least where we think it's headed. So we're sort of on the side of CBDs a little more than suburbs, but again, with low conviction.
Gila?
All right, I have a little higher conviction about it, but I think Will is spot on. It's about the people, and people want to be with the other people. So I do think that the office in suburbia might really not pan out the way people thought it would. I think people are going to come back to the office. And if you're reading the news and you're looking at what the investment banks are doing, and clearly I agree with you that companies don't know where they'll be in a year from now as things keep shifting. The favorite term I think of the pandemic was unprecedented times, but it's true. Like, it's hard to gauge what the next year is going to bring. But I do think if you want to be part of the mix, you have to be back in the office. And if you want to get paid, your New York salary, as James Gorman likes to say, you have to be in the New York office, not in Boise, Idaho. So there are definitely trends of bringing people back. And I think there's going to be a big push to do that if they can figure out the logistics around people feeling safe and comfortable and the vaccines continuing to work. And I think that'll be really part of the deciding factor as to what happens.
And I can tell you just from our market perspective, the leasing activity that has occurred in our market has not been, we're adjacent to San Francisco. So I guess we would be the market that all of a sudden sees these new, tech companies popping up, new, satellite offices. And there are compelling reasons why they do that. And that does happen. But I can say specifically around COVID, the leasing activity hasn't been from tenants moving over from the Bay Area. It's primarily just been organic growth within our market.
So not a whole lot of spoke activity.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Maybe.
Let's talk a little bit about primary versus secondary markets as well. That's been kind of one of the big themes as we kind of come through this year is the idea that people have left the main cities and have gone to secondary markets as well. I think somebody mentioned Boise. That's might even be a tertiary market. What do you think about primary versus secondary markets? And in particular, are certain gateway markets moving in different directions? I know, Gila, you have a lot to say. I'm going to ask you right now, Gila, is New York dead?
Oh, New York is the center of the universe. It's never going to be dead. So anybody who said New York is going to be dead, you're wrong. No, I'm just joking. I think things change. New York is going to be difficult for a couple of years, but if you look at office trends in general, it's a cyclical market, right? Office comes and goes. And if you're an office investor, you're in it for the long run. You're typically not going into office in a CBD in a New York, a San Francisco, an LA, or a London with the expectation that you can be in and out in 2 years and make your money. You expect to ride it out, and that's part of what you do. And that's okay. But the trend of secondary markets, I think, Loretta, started long before the pandemic. People were moving to Austin and to Charlotte and Raleigh and Nashville. And I think there's a lot of discussion about those cities becoming bigger CBDs for office for people who are looking for a lifestyle change from working in New York. Does that mean that New York CBD is going anywhere? Absolutely not. It just means that now there are other options for people who are looking for a different lifestyle. And that's a good trend, in my opinion, right? It gives more flexibility. It gives more interest. You are building beautiful buildings in downtown these cities. If you ask Mike from Texas Treasury, he'll tell you, please don't move to Austin because, we're killing the traffic down there. But aside from that, I think it's really good to see that these cities, Miami is becoming a trendy city for office. I think that's good for the market. It gives us investors opportunities to look elsewhere outside of the big three cities in the United States. But I don't think it changes New York, San Francisco, LA, London. I don't think that changes Tokyo, for sure not.
Let me go to you, Will.
I always struggle with this, question, as mentioned earlier, just because there are so many differences market by market to go to kind of the primary versus secondary or even regional comparisons. I agree completely with what was just said on the secondary markets sort of attracting a little more capital. I think that was the implication there. A market like Raleigh, North Carolina has realized almost 100 basis point decline in same store cap rates, according to NCREIF tracking of offices, whereas at the national level, office cap rates have been approximately flat. So that's purely or mostly sort of a capital allocation story, and that's not occurring in the primary market. So I think insofar as some of these secondary markets were institutionalizing in the past, they're probably institutionalized now because there's really not a big difference between those cap rate numbers. Just to kind of expand a little bit on that theme of middle-aged workers or connect that to a market like Austin, Texas has actually done pretty poorly during the pandemic, despite being kind of like the poster child for population growth and tech companies. Austin, Texas has a large middle-aged workforce, a lot of people in their 30s and 40s, not actually very many in their 50s and 60s. And those in their 20s is actually only about the same as kind of the national average. So because they have that middle-aged workforce, they have embraced, at least in my opinion, this is the causal effect, they've embraced work from home more than other markets. The vacancy rate there was around 7% before the pandemic and is close to 17% today by CBRE's tracking. So that's one of the kind of worst deteriorations in fundamentals as measured just by vacancy despite many positive factors for the Austin, Texas market. So again, that's kind of more in the secondary space, and secondary is generally doing well, but that's a notable exception.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was just going to say, I think when we talk about demand changes in office, the discussion for some reason does tend to shift around moving from one market to the next, or with that sort of thing. I think the bigger discussion is around the why, and I think we've kind of touched on this versus the how on office space. Our secondary market, and actually, Loretta, if you don't mind, I just have two quick data points on the slides there. Our secondary market has performed very well through COVID. It hasn't been pre-COVID levels, certainly, but it's performed, I think by most measures pretty well. And in that, look at the San Francisco market next to us. And I drew some data points here just to kind of show the stark contrast. Obviously, San Francisco is arguably the poster child of changes in office usage. You see that negative absorption is expected through 2022. Quarterly market rent growth bottomed at negative 11%, and it's currently still negative. Our market right across the hill has performed very well. And this isn't a shift in tenants from the Bay Area to our market. If you flip to the next slide, we also pulled some data points on our portfolio. Fairly small portfolio, but we've signed 20 new leases during COVID. We've added square footage. We've had about 3/4 of our tenants on rollover. They've decided to stay the same square footage or grow. And you can take the slides off. I just wanted to show those kind of data points. And this goes back to the why. And I touched on, we haven't seen tenants move over from the Bay Area. That's not the story here. The story here is just kind of the differences between why people are and why employers are maybe having a more reluctant time to return to work in primary markets than they are in secondary markets. And this kind of gets back to the why. I think for employees, long commute times have been something that's just been, exacerbated. And then with COVID, they had a chance to take a pause on that. Heavy reliance on public transit, denser office environments. For the employers, higher cost of real estate, and the ability to attract people who wanted a hybrid work environment. And this isn't to say that, going back to primary markets, secondary markets, that there's a huge change, but rather to just say that in primary markets, those sort of existential discussions will have to flesh themselves out over time, and employers will have to decide how they want to engage. But in our market, we just haven't seen that, and it's just because our market doesn't have the same things that keep people out of the office. And I think that's true with secondary markets in general. They're just not as they don't have the same resistance that you see in primary markets to returning to work.
And I think we'll see some of that bifurcation continue. I do think commute is an interesting element to raise. Gila mentioned it earlier. Don't move to Austin. The traffic's getting too bad. Don't make the traffic worse. And I think that's something that you definitely see. The other element, the public transit question, the CBDs that have a lot of people commuting on trains or light rail, you see maybe more demand in the more car-oriented commute locations. Is that something that I think everyone can agree on?
We've seen a higher return to work in our office spaces where there is, surface parking, that sort of thing, certainly.
Well, I would say that I think that people prefer if they can drive in their own car. But if you look at cities like Tokyo, where everybody goes on mass transit, everybody's masked up, and even New York, York and you read, the incidences, they've been tracking COVID cases, using subways and public transit, and they have not seen a spike of COVID through that means of transportation. And, you can believe it or not, depending on, who you are, and if you want to believe that it's encouraging for people to come back to work. But truly, if that's not, if that doesn't indicate that there's a spike that way, then look, then public transportation needs to be used. And frankly, I think we're in a position at this point where, while we don't know the future, we're starting to realize that COVID might be something we have to live with a little longer term, considering the changes that have been, been recalled and brought up over the past few weeks. And if that's the case, then how do we adapt and get back to the office in the big cities? Because companies at some point will lose patience with people who don't come back, and you'll have to start making decisions. Are you going to get vaccinated? Will you go back to the office? If you're not going to go back to the office, what will you do? Are there other employment opportunities that you'd be willing to take? Are you moving out of your CBDs? And there's a whole cascading waterfall that comes from that. And I think people are going to have to start making decisions as the summer comes to a close with what they're going to do with their firm. So I am very curious.
Yeah, Will, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I agree with what was said, in that commute times are certainly a factor. And I think this may be a distinction without a difference, but commute times probably matter more than public transit ridership. So yes, New York was quick to move to work from home, and they've been coming back more slowly, but they have both factors of a lot of public transit usage and also long commute times. There are some markets, Austin, which was mentioned, commute times are getting longer there, and they have also been embracing work from home quicker than a market like Milwaukee or Albuquerque, where commute times are fairly small. So I just put the focus on how long does it take people to get to work as the factor, more than are they using public transit to get there.
And I have a question that's come in from the audience. This is a question that they're hoping you guys can weigh in on, something that the previous panel also talked about, which was lease renewals. Can you speak to lease renewals post-COVID, or at least, it's hard to say. I keep wanting to say post-COVID, but we're not post-COVID. We're like post-middle COVID, hopefully.
We're all hoping it'll be over.
We're no longer pre-COVID. Let's just say that. Ryan, maybe you can start on it, and then I'll go to Will and Gila about what you're seeing around lease renewals in the office sector.
I kind of touched on it already, but I in our market, just because there hasn't been this push not to return to work, there's been a very active return to work in our market. It's reflected in the lease renewals, it's reflected in the rental rates, that sort of thing. So it's been, I would say generally. The other thing, we operate more in multi-tenant buildings, and so that's been an advantage. I would because it allows us, if a tenant wants to downsize, we have other options for them. Typically, we're able to pick up a higher rent per square foot when they do downsize.
Will?
In our portfolio, before so we don't have a huge enough portfolio to say this is like statistically significant data representing the whole the whole country, but we had somewhere in the range of 75 to 80% renewal rates before the pandemic. And when the pandemic began, our base view was that would drop to around 65%. And so that's a fairly negative outcome. As of the last reading, which I had looked at about a month ago, we were at 72%. So it is lower, measurably lower than what it was before the pandemic, but that's really a pretty positive number, in my opinion. And if we kind of look at what we were projecting for rents and vacancies and income levels, that kind of key assumption is why we were a little bit too negative, in the summer of 2020, and really office has performed a little better than we were expecting.
I think Ryan and Will are spot on. I think people who were able to come in when the prices dropped, that 15 to 25%, took very long leases because they got great prices and they wanted to keep them. I think others came in and took, maybe a bit shorter, but I think overall the leasing market hasn't changed as much as people thought it would. There are smaller companies who are, came out of B buildings and looked for flexibility in A buildings, and took mid leases because they're just not sure about their longevity, but to be in an A building at a better price was very appealing. But other than that, I think people really did take normal leases. So I happen to think that it's a very positive trend, much more positive than people were projecting.
And I think you mentioned some of these are coming in at very long term, but are you seeing any trend towards shorter lease terms as we kind of move out of the pandemic? I'm seeing Gila shaking her head no. That doesn't sound like it's a trend that you're seeing.
I don't think so, unless they're smaller companies that are looking for specific flexibility because they think they're going to relocate to one of those nascent cities like the Nashville, Austin, But other than that, I think we're seeing things stay pretty status quo. But I'd love to hear Will's opinion on it.
In our portfolio, we had quite a few tenants who were doing 1-year renewals last summer. That's sort of gone away though, and it's back to 5 and 10 years. So if you just look at the simple average, it is shorter. But if you pull those 1 years out, which aren't happening as much today, it's pretty much exactly where it was pre-pandemic.
And I have another question from the audience. Just a reminder, we've got the Q&A button if you want to jump in or submit any questions. As it seems safe to assume different markets will recover or not at different paces, they'd love to hear a city each panelist is bullish on and a city each panelist is bearish on, and why. So you can each pick one up and down city. I'm gonna start with you, Gila.
So New York, I do think New York is going to come back. Just give it some time. It's going to take a bit, but I do think there are opportunities that are going to be here, and it's going to be great. I think Miami is the city that I'm not so hot on. I think it was a quick trend, and everybody ran down there. And, the multifamily housing market exploded, and the office market exploded, and I saw a little meme come across my screen yesterday. So the problem with living in Florida is you actually have to live in Florida. So people from New York in particular are really kind of looking at Florida and going, oh, did I really move down to Miami? I need to go back to New York. So we'll see. I don't know if it's going to stay as hot as it's been. I think the traffic there is exploded. I don't think that the way that they're taxing people in Florida is really long-term able to continue if every hedge fund from New York moves down there. So I do think that the trends there will change somewhat over the next couple of years, and I'm eager to see how that plays out. So
is there
put that on the record.
Is there also a climate risk questions around Miami? I mean, it's pretty much on sea level.
Yeah, it definitely got highlighted by the Surfside collapse this year, and the tragedy that happened there. And we do look at coastal cities with a little bit more interest, considering we're Japanese and we're very focused on climate. So definitely on our list of things that we take into consideration. But we just think that the Miami hype was really a hype, and we're not sure it's going to be able to sustain the level that it's at right now.
All right, and I'm going to go to Ryan, although I might be able to guess your cities.
Well, I can only speak to the markets I know. I'll actually say I'm very long-term bullish on San Francisco, short-term bullish in our market, simply because there's a broad perception that office is suffering, but our fundamentals aren't really showing that. But any primary market it obviously goes without saying is a safe bet. It's just a question of timing and duration.
Will?
A market that I like today is Denver. Denver has had some vacancy or kind of fundamental declines, vacancy increases due again to that middle-aged workforce effect, but they have long-term drivers that are a little more positive than other markets, at least in my view. And the pricing is still reasonably good there based on deals we've screened recently. Areas of concern, it's hard to pick on a market without kind of having seen pricing within the last couple of months because it's moving so quickly. A deal that we had looked at in the Phoenix market was priced too aggressively, or kind of the way the winning bidder was underwriting that seems like it probably was not going to come to fruition. And we kind of, our intrinsic value estimate was a double-digit percentage below where it traded. So that's a market that we would have paid something like 15 or 20% less than where it actually transacted. And then we have other markets where we're the winner, and we maybe would have paid 5 or 10% more than what we got it for. So that one at least sticks out for now.
One of the big themes that we kind of that came up in the first panel was one of sort of a bifurcation but in the market, in the office market, where they're sort of the haves and the have-nots as far as office goes, and that we're looking to see some, you know, obsolescence around that. When you think about CBD versus suburban or primary versus secondary markets, where do you think sort of demand, supply, and obsolescence trends are going in those places? And I'm going to start with you, Will, to kind of touch on, you know, what kind of obsolescence trends are we seeing, especially with regard to supply, demand on these different dimensions?
Yeah. So I normally don't have a lot of thoughts on this topic because this is something that our asset managers are more focused on. But today there's sort of a unique situation going on, which probably everyone who's dialed into this webinar is aware of, which is that housing prices have gone through the roof over the last year and a half. And conversions from high-rise offices into condos or into apartments are a material tailwind for office kind of supply-demand fundamentals today. The downtown Manhattan market, I suspect, will have less office space 5 years from now than it does today because of those conversions. And that's true in many other markets as well. I mean, the only thing that really could stop that is if we see something like a 20% pop in rents in downtown Manhattan over the next 5 years. Otherwise, it just pencils out too well to convert those into residential. And that's true in a lot of other CBD locations. So that's at least a positive story from the supply side of the office sector. And
Gila, thoughts on bifurcation and what you're seeing on the different trends?
So I'm seeing, we hear a lot from people about how they're converting office to life science and medical lab. I mean, that seems to be the hottest trend in every conversation now is, oh, we're doing medical lab now too. It's definitely interesting to hear people's thoughts on how they can take an office and make it into a proper lab facility, because we do think that there are a lot of challenges with doing that if you don't have the right bones to begin with. But we like to see that people are being creative about the conversions to multifamily, to life science, to anything else that they think would be beneficial for that space, and that people are really being creative. And that's good. It's good for the industry to see people thinking hard about what to do to help make sure that investors like us have returns that they need in order to bring back. So we think about it that way. But office is here to stay in some shape or form, and I think that's really the question is, what will it look like in 10 years, and will it be more co-working like, or in suburbia, or really in CBD, and does it change internally because post-COVID people want different things out of their office? And I think that's what people are trying to envision and imagine and then bring to the table, and that's a good thing.
And Ryan?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing more preference for amenitized office spaces and less dense space. So it's even on the tenants that have downsized, I can think of a couple examples where they took less space, but for more space per square footage. So at least in our markets, we're certainly seeing, especially where real estate's cheap, we're seeing that people are opting for a less dense work environment.
And I want to maybe go into sort of our final wrap up now. As we wrap up, I'm hoping we can go around to each of you for a final takeaway. We did this with the previous panel. We're going to do this again. What's your sort of key takeaway from today? And what office investment strategy do you think offers attractive risk-adjusted returns? And I'm going to start with Ryan. And sort of let each of you kind of give one pitch for one strategy.
So key takeaways, real estate's local, broad market fundamentals don't always correlate well down to individual markets. I think in some markets, we don't have enough, it seems there's not enough transactable data yet to know where the bottom is and what the growth projections looks like going forward. So I think that's the biggest thing is we're all, in some markets, it seems, I have a colleague in New York who does value add investing in office buildings, and they're kind of on the sideline right now because they're looking to see where the transactable data allows them to underwrite new acquisitions. but then in other markets, obviously, there is a lot of transactable data. The one thing I was thinking about going into this is we really have found a bright spot with multi-tenant, highly multi-tenant office buildings. It's obviously a lot more management intensive, but going through COVID, it has just allowed us to be a lot more flexible with tenant needs. It's obviously a lot more diversification. And generally what we found is we have better negotiating leverage. I think our average portfolio tenant size is 5,000 square feet or something like that, very small. And that has allowed us as tenants, even when they're downsizing, we've had more negotiating leverage on term and on rental rate, that sort of thing. So definitely highly multi-tenant has been good for us.
All right. Will?
I'm going to give a kind of boring answer, and it's sort of similar to what I think Jonathan Ross said on the prior panel. But since the question was risk-adjusted returns, Loretta, I think office buildings that have long-term leases with an investment-grade tenant are still trading at kind of higher cap rates than I would expect. So these aren't going to be like home runs or grand slams, but maybe a single or a double. And the reason for that is the kind of institutional, very safe, maybe sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, insurance companies that normally invest in the safest, most core office assets view the office sector with it's a stigmatized sector with some trepidation. And so that sort of part of the capital stack is not as active as it used to be. But that takes the right type of investor who is willing to realize a pretty low kind of stable return. One other just micro strategy, I think there's still some fear of co-working within office, amongst office investors. So a building that has a couple floors of co-working tenants in place may be worth still considering, because I think there's some investors that don't like that type of space. And I think that's really an amenity and will be sort of a long-term solution, long-term amenity for office owners and tenants that are in the building.
And Gila?
I also agree with, I was listening to Doug Schwartz and to Jonathan on the last panel. I mean, I think they hit the nail on the head. It's about location, it's about the right building. And I think I agree with Will that, having some boring tenants who are investment grade and stay long-term leases in great buildings is really what you want as an office owner, right? You really want to keep things a bit boring, long-term holds, looking to do that, through the cycle. And, and that's something that we've done, over and over and over again. So that's not going to be necessarily where you're going to make your big bucks, right? As part of your portfolio, that's your core, smart, stable assets. But I do think that it's been hard to think about it recently because there have been very few large scale transactions in the last 18 months. And the market is waiting a little bit. Nobody wants to buy high and sell low. So it's, people are waiting around to see what happens. So as soon as things start transacting again in the bigger buildings, I think there'll be more data to support any of these theses.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Thank you, Gila. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Will. Again, this panel has been looking at office markets, urban versus suburban, and secondary and primary markets. Following this panel, we will take a short break of 10 minutes and come back to discuss traditional office versus niche office. So that will be, the medical office, the life science, the creative co-working, everything that we been dancing around and kind of touching on up to this point. We'll be able to really dig into it in the final panel. So let me just thank my panelists again, and we'll have a short 10-minute break. Thank you. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's get started with our third panel. I'm going to ask the other panelists to come on in, and we will have our discussion looking at traditional versus niche office, and in particular looking at the niche office properties. So to kick things off, let me start with our panelists. Let's maybe give their introductions, name and title, and a little bit about what to do. I'm going to start things off with Joe.
Good afternoon, everybody, or I guess good morning on the West Coast. Thanks for having me. And you can hear me okay, right? My microphone's working? Okay,
You sound
good.
great. You sound great.
Okay, great. Joe Gorin, I'm with Barings. I head up our acquisitions on the US real estate side as well as portfolio management. On our US side, we're about $11 billion of AUM. Barings is about a $380 billion asset manager globally. But again, US 11 billion and real estate in total about 50 billion across the globe. Thanks for having me.
Hi, yes, I'm Andrew. I work for Clodfelter. I lead our real estate research, and we are an investment consultant advising institutional investors from pensions endowments to high net worth and RIA type clients. We invest across the globe and across kind of the capital stack, and with a focus mainly on real estate private equity funds. Thanks.
And Chad.
Hey everybody, Chad Phillips here. I work for Nuveen Real Estate. I oversee the office sector globally for Nuveen. The real estate investment management firm oversees about $130 billion of assets. The office sector oversees about $25 billion globally.
And this panel, we're looking at traditional versus niche office, but what I think we'll really be talking about is the more niche questions within that. And so I think maybe the first place to sort of start is to ask, how does alternative or niche office space differ from traditional office product? And I'm going to go over to you, Chad. When you think about what these alternative or niche office sectors are, how do they differ from your standard traditional office building and product?
Yeah, sure. I phrase it as that we have an alternative approach to office, is the way that I've been phrasing it internally and externally. It seems to resonate. And there's really three business lines within that. It's life science, medical office, and the third one would be kind of boutique creative office on the third one. And I contrast that with traditional office in the sense that the bulk of the traditional office is, let's call it, in 30 to 40 story high-rise buildings that were largely built in the 80s and 90s, which have a lot of functional obsolescence. And so the three business lines that we're talking about, or that I focus on, the medical office, life science, and kind of the boutique-y, highly stylized modern office, we see there's lots of tailwinds in that sector and a little bit of headwinds of what I would categorize as a lot of the more commodity space built in the 80s and 90s.
I'm going to go over to you, Joe, as well, to kind of talk about how you think about alternative or niche office space and how you see it differing from a traditional office product.
Yeah, I mean, I second what Chad said. I mean, those are the categories we're interested in, and I think primarily because that's the category of office that people want right now. There's a definition of office which is special. And we talked about the trends around who wants to be in the office right now, and remote working is a real option. Not to say that people aren't going back into an office, but if companies believe that remote working isn't here to stay in some capacity, I think they're wrong. And so that makes the office environment that much more important. There has to be a reason that an employer wants to be there. There has to be a reason that the employee wants to be there. The skilled workforce, it's all about skilled talent for the office sector right now. So we have to utilize real estate to attract and retain great workers. Employers have to do it. Well, we're the landlords. We've got to create it. So this idea of niche is really about how do we get people into the niche environment. No longer can we just accept a commodity office building or a traditional office building, as Chad said, big, 40,000 square foot floor plate in a big CBD that doesn't have any kind of brand recognition. It's not modern. It doesn't have the big light and air exposure. It doesn't have that ability to attract. So I kind of think about niche as really what's the new office environment? Is it life science? Is it STEM oriented office? Is it flex office? Because this idea of the traditional office is it's becoming more commodity, and there's going to be a higher level of obsolescence, and that doesn't deter us as office investors. In fact, it makes me even more bullish and have higher conviction into the strategies that Chad is talking about. And there's a lot of tailwinds on the demand side, but we have to be just as cautious. I have a couple CBD office assets that I want to sell to the last panel. Based on their bullishness around CBD in some of the markets, especially I love Gila, but I've got a building for you. But I
call him.
yeah. So
I believe that might count as a no marketing rule. So we'll,
I was joking.
first time we sold a building on IREI Live. We're going to go to you, Andrew. When you work with your clients and talk about sort of the alternative or niche sectors, what are they interested in, and are they looking for something different from a traditional office?
Absolutely. So we think about real estate from a holistic perspective and do try to generally seek opportunistic returns across kind of the sectors. And I think within office right now, there is pretty good exposure to, suburban and CBD office. I think where clients are most interested in gaining exposure is places that are non-traditional office, in the sense of I still call them more employment nodes than I do niche sectors, because it's things like media, it's the life sciences. They're very specialized, almost employment buildings is the way I think of them. And if you think about where the job gains have been over the past 4 years, over the past 8 years, it's been in tech, it's been in media, it's been in all these kind of niche office sectors that are a little bit more, they're very specialized in terms of what they need as a tenant from the space itself. And it's also very hard to replace that tenant. It's not easy to rebuild a life sciences building for a non-life sciences tenant. It doesn't necessarily make sense. So our clients typically are looking for those opportunistic strategies where you can create stabilized assets and sell them to those core buyers out there who are looking for office exposure, or what I would consider more employment exposure. But those kind of tenants and the underlying fundamentals of the businesses that those tenants are in, they themselves are strong in growth kind of sectors where, there continues to be strong demand from their underlying fundamentals, to where you don't necessarily have to worry if those tenants, if a Netflix or something like that is going to pay you rent. It just seems like that's kind of where the credit market is going, and where the stable cash flow, the long-term cash flow is coming from. Feeding into creating assets that REITs would like to buy, or core funds would like to buy. I think that's kind of what we look for. And right now it seems like those funds, they're demanding these niche sectors, less so the traditional office. So we think about it that way.
Thanks, Andrew. One of the things that's been coming up repeatedly today, and so I think we should definitely address this, is the question of obsolescence in the office market, the potential for adaptive reuse, and the question of the life science conversion. I wonder if each of you has an opinion on it. I think we maybe in the first panel, it may have been mentioned that life science conversions can be quite difficult depending on the office building. I also have a comment from the audience that says that actually life science conversions, they're not difficult in older buildings. They disagree with that take. So I'd love to maybe go start with Chad, then Joe, and then Andrew, and maybe kind of talk on this question of obsolescence and conversion.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, just from a general standpoint, there is going to be some obsolescence from some of the sort of 70s and 80s products that we've talked about. But as you pivot more towards the repurposing and the transition from a certain type of product to a life science product, it can certainly be done. We're doing it across multiple different types. It can be difficult, so you just have to know sort of what you're doing. One story is easier than multi-story for the conversion, because the buildings have to have capacity for loading, and these have the right floor heights, et cetera. But we've been able to do it across multiple types of buildings. One particular building was a former car manufacturing and showroom. It has really, really high floor loads. It has capacity to come in and out. It's a multi-story building. It's able to be converted. It takes a ton of work, but it can be done. The one-story stuff is clearly easier. There's some flex product out there that almost looks like quasi office in the front and industrial in the back, and that can be converted a little bit easier. But it's a trend that you're seeing around the country for sure, because there's a lot of demand right now for life science, and you just got to be cognizant of what the specifications are. not everybody, not everyone's gonna be able to pull it off successfully, right? There are going to be some hiccups in there because it's a highly specialized use, but it can certainly be done.
Joe?
Yeah, I agree with Chad. I mean, and I agree with the audience member. You can definitely convert old buildings. It's all about, the 3 to 4 most common factors, as Chad said. It's the floor loading, so you want at least about 100 pounds per live load on the flooring. Common rule of thumb in terms of slab to slab height: 13 to 14 foot slab to slab. 15 to 16 is fantastic. You can do it in a 100-year-old building. You can do it in a brand new building. You also want the right elevator capacity. So you want the right elevator cores because you need the big service elevators. And the other challenge that Chad had quickly mentioned is really the height. It's going to be hard to convert older high-rise buildings. Typically, once you get above the 7th floor, you get into restrictions around hazardous waste removal and how you're going to deal with a lot of the spacing. So it's very accommodative in a lot of these buildings that meet those requirements. Not all buildings meet the requirements. And a lot of folks are looking at trying to convert buildings with 11-foot slab to slabs and 80 pounds per live load. And so as you're investing with sponsors, you want to make sure that they really understand what's important to the end user. There are some lighter touch life science companies that might be okay with those specifications, but you're really limiting your demand pool. The first part of your question about adaptive reuse, I put that in the niche category of that's a great opportunity to create that special product for the tech companies, the groups that are, most often you can take an old industrial building or a brick and beam building and turn it into something really special that speaks to any innovative company that's trying to create a cool, unique environment for the highly skilled tech millennial or Gen Z worker. And as an example, we're going to be working on a placemaking project in Nashville where we take some old product, we build some new product alongside it, and we really create a place. So when we think about adaptive reuse and everything around office, it's not just the building itself, it's everything around it. Does it create that environment where cutting edge employees and employers want to inhabit? That's a theme that you're going to continue to hear me talk about. Innovation. We want to attract those innovative tenants because that's where you see value creation, not just coming out of the pandemic. I think it's much more magnified coming out of the pandemic, but we were seeing this trend evolve over the past 20 years because of the evolution of technology. It's all impacting the way we at Barings particularly, we're looking at where we're going to invest next.
And that really builds
Yeah,
I was gonna say that's really, we're right there. You're building on some of the themes that have been kind of brought up in some of these earlier panels as well. The idea of what the tenant wants and how to kind of go out and reach them. Andrew?
Yeah, I think another consideration, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, is that it's very expensive to convert, to a life sciences. And if you think about kind of the numbers, you're spending $175 a square foot in TIs to some of these tenants all day, and upwards, closer to probably 300 in certain markets, I would imagine. You don't need to spend that much money in office kind of buildings. So it definitely is more of a risky proposition overall, because you obviously need to get a return on that capital that you're spending. So, it's being very careful and thoughtful before you go into that acquisition. And, I'm not going to reiterate the points that Joe and Chad made in terms of what tenants seem to be looking for in terms of heights and everything. But, it's more about getting the right basis. I think whether you're doing the development or you're doing conversion, at the end of the day, you're only going to be able to achieve certain rents. And so you just want to keep that in mind too.
Can I just, just to piggyback on what Andrew was saying, what he's getting to is the market, right? You're not going to convert this stuff in a market that's not an important life science cluster, or you vision into the emerging node of that life science, but it's still going to have the research institutions, the funding. But, I'd much rather stabilize my basis at $800 to $1,000 a foot on a life science conversion, where I know that rents are $70 to $100 a foot, triple net, and there's a great demand wave coming behind all the tenants who are looking for space currently, who will pay that, 70 to 100. Now we're doing a deal as an example in downtown San Diego, will stabilize that deal at $850 a foot. You couldn't get me to buy a stabilized office building down in downtown San Diego for $400 to $500 a foot. But I'll gladly stabilize life science conversion at $850 because that's a much different category of the fundamentals are just completely different. So be very careful on where you're looking to convert buildings for life science. And we'll continue to do it in these important kind of the 5 most important nodes for life science, and we'll do it in emerging locations where you have that work live play element. The other thing about life science that's important and it's evolving is we have so many graduates now who are attracted to life science because of all the great research opportunities there are. And so now, the old life science buildings, they could be crappy. They didn't have to be in the exact right location. They had to be around MIT or Harvard, but they didn't have to have the bells and whistles that the creative tech buildings had. Now these research companies and these biotech companies and these innovative companies they have to do the same thing the tech companies did 5-10 years ago. They have to be in great buildings now to attract these scientists who have choices. And so we're seeing some evolution around life science where you're having to compete, you have to use real estate the same way that the creative tech guys were.
So you're seeing the
Yeah,
same
I would jump in.
in amenitization.
Oh, sorry,
I'm just saying, so
I was going to jump in.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just going to jump in and basically say that the guys are spot on this. And on the basis, look, it is a lot of upfront basis on it, but one of the benefits is that hopefully the tenants are a little stickier in the long term and pay the higher rent, right? So the returns sort of translate when you go through the renewal probability and the releasing because they're going to be sticky from that particular perspective. And Joe's right about sort of the intersection of tech and bioscience and the recruiting and the type of space that you need. I mean, we're seeing some buildings that are basically being built to spec life science standards, but then a tech tenant will take it, and that's fine too, right? If they're willing to take it as well. But the standards on what you're building are almost the same on the outset.
Yeah,
we could probably spend an hour just talking about this. I mean, Chad, you're spot on. In fact, I'll give you an example. We looked at a life science opportunity. I can't tell you exactly where in the country, but it's a life science area. And we were looking at speccing it out to life science. We're talking 120 pound per live load, 16-foot slab to slab. And we may end up doing some stuff with tech companies, not life science, similar rents. And so why are they demanding that level of specification? Artificial science. And so now you're seeing this convergence where some tech companies are requiring laboratories to do artificial science work, not just life science work. So we're seeing this convergence across industries. Food, I was touring through a project and it was laboratory space, and it was one of these, I don't want to say they're using chemicals in food, but they're basically researching, how to, the impossible burger. And so you're seeing this need for very specialized, important, valuable real estate, not just by life science companies, but innovative companies.
Right, across that. I want to maybe think if we could kind of dig into some of these different niches and kind of take each one in turn and maybe get your sort of perspectives on what the investment opportunities there are. So I'm going to start off with one that I think Andrew's mentioned to me that I think is really interesting, which is production studio space. So I'd love to hear each of you, any of you who do actually look at production studio, what you think the opportunity there is. So I'm gonna start with you, Andrew. I know you're kind of keen on studios.
Yeah, no, I think there are a couple key nodes similar to the life sciences market. It seems, there's the Pinewood asset over in London. So it's not even just the US where this is a phenomenon. It really is across the world where because of the Netflixes and the Disney Pluses and everything else out there, demand for studio is ever increasing. And exactly like Chad and Joe said, where's Apple putting its studio in LA? It's putting it in the middle of Culver City. And so these are, in my opinion, the employment nodes of the future. And sound, you need all of the other aspects of that too, sound stages, beyond just the studio space. And the vacancies across those markets are extremely, extremely tight. You have some queues again to get into the best space for TV shoots that all paused a little bit during the pandemic, but It is that's an industry where, you can't film remotely. It doesn't work if everybody's in their own bedrooms filming. And similar to life science, it's very hard to do those sorts of employments remotely. So future-proofing those cash flows or thinking about where those tenants can move, they're trying to attract the best employees. They're also trying to build the best programs, and to do that, they are spending up for that space. So, happy to pass it along with it. That's kind of what I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, Chad or Joe, any interest in discussing the studio or media?
Yeah, I'll jump in. We have strong interest in it. We own assets, studio assets, both in LA and in New York. And there's two things really going on. To Andrew's point, and this applies to kind of everything we're talking about. What we're trying to do is invest in spaces that are future-proof, so you can't do it from home, right? And that will always have a need for the purpose-built space. So studio certainly applies to that. And then if you look at the demand side, the number of requests out there for sound stages and studio spaces is far trumping the amount of available space. So the supply dynamic is working out. So, the only thing that I'd say is that there are a limited number of cities where it really works, right? So we have them in New York and LA, and, there's some of it in Atlanta, but it's a limited number of markets that really have a thriving studio space.
So similar to the sort of life science node question, it is a clustering around these employment centers.
Yep.
Joe, thoughts if you want?
We don't have anything specifically around studio, but I would just highlight the market location and the emerging trend of where this may evolve in the future. I think that Nashville, we like Nashville for a number of reasons. We love Nashville because of the growing entertainment business. It's not just country music anymore. It's everything music, and it's TV. And so I would just add on that, we like Nashville. We would do a adaptive reuse or a cool studio space. We just haven't done it.
Here's another niche property that we haven't talked a lot about. Does anyone want to jump in with any thoughts on the sort of the more medical office, healthcare driven office? This is one that does not have the same sort of clustering effect. Isn't that right? Chad?
I'm happy to jump in with a couple of thoughts. Yeah, we invest heavily in the medical office space. And to your point, like for life science, we might look at 6 to 8 markets, right? For studio, we look at a few. For medical office, we'll look at the top 50 countries around, or top 50 cities around the country. And it's really about the fact that you're just providing services to the population. So think of it almost more like how you would do the demographic studies and the demand studies for shopping centers, right? So people are going to need care in every single market, but people don't need to have a headquarters or a life science location in every market. So the medical office situation is a little bit different. It's more expansive across the country. And there is strong need. I mean, if you look at healthcare overall, it's a huge part of the overall economy. And if you look at the aging demographics, it'll continue to grow. You can buy a lot of credit-backed investments in the medical office space. And then there's also a trend right now, or it has been going on for a while, more off-campus medical office, right? So you're bringing the care to more convenient locations to the population, sort of away from the medical centers. And that's a trend that you're seeing as well.
Anyone else want to kind of jump in on med office?
Yeah, I think very much like Chad was saying, definitely seeing some more specialized medical office buildings or quasi-medical office buildings like ambulatory care or a lot of outpatient. I think there's a lot more growth bringing the care to people, and also just because technology has improved in the medical sector to where you don't need to do everything in a hospital anymore. And so I agree with Chad in that for me, it's more like retail, where you're thinking about how can I best serve, a subset of the population with X element or whatever, because these tenants are coming into your space, and it's not like you just have the same office tenants coming in on a daily basis. You have many new people walking through your doors that you don't. So one, that they are a little bit stickier tenants too, because people like that familiarity of knowing where your doctor's office is and not having to look it up and see it change every 2 seconds, similar to like a grocery, like to know where your grocery store is, and you don't want that changing every year. So I think there's, it's similar, but it definitely is needs to be thought about different than office.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add, and we obviously like the product type and the sector, because you've got the tailwinds. You know, you look at the demographic trends, you've got an aging population, you've got a tremendous amount of money that's gone into healthcare. But you got to be careful, you know, not stretching too far out somewhere to life science. You want to be in the right locations. And, you know, one question I have is just, you know, the emerging, you know, opportunity for telehealth, taking away some of that demand. But it obviously the tailwinds are so strong that I don't think it's going to be a massive impact, but it just means that location is critically important when, you know, people have that option to do it, you know, just as we're doing a lot of our stuff virtual, you can do a lot of health work virtual too. You can't do the life science remote, but you can do a little bit of the doctor work remote.
I think that's right. And so you're seeing a lot of the investments in sort of the higher acuity, more specialized services, as opposed to just sort of family practice or whatnot. Or so the higher the acuity, the ambulatory surgery, the cancer centers, et cetera, those are always going to have a need for those. So I think you can bifurcate even medical office to, you know, several subsectors underneath it.
I had shoulder surgery about a year ago in an office building. General anesthesia. I mean, it felt like an office building. That's what I went into. So it's amazing what they're doing now.
Let me throw out another sort of space, co-working. That was the big thing, and then it wasn't because of the pandemic, and we all just sort of worked from home. Is that something that you're thinking about, and do you see that as sort of a niche or an alternative office use?
I mean, I can start that one. I look, I think it's nice to have around the edges, and it's kind of too soon to tell. A lot of the conversation we've had in the previous panels, you know, I would just highlight that it's so early. That, you know, we want a lot of the answers in office. We have to remember that leases expire, you know, 3, 5, 7, 10 years down the road. There's a lot of big leases in New York City that haven't expired. And I've talked to a lot of CEOs who've said, yeah, I don't need all my space. So, you know, this idea of, so what about co-working? You know, is that going to be the new future? I don't know. But when you look at the trends around remote working and how people are, you know, looking at office space, it certainly speaks to the attractiveness of co-working. I do think that companies are looking at basically creating their space as co-working so that can compete against some of the co-working that currently exists on a third party basis. But I think landlords need to get creative and provide that option on a floor or two, and within their buildings, they're going to be in the co-working business to attract more demand. I think we just have to rethink about it. You know, how are we going to make our space more attractive? And one of the tools in the tool belt is certainly co-working on, you know, by the landlord, not necessarily by WeWork. You know, if you ask me, what do I think about, you know, third-party service providers as you know, their opportunity going forward, I don't know. But I know it's an opportunity for landlords.
Andrew, I see you nodding.
Yeah, you know, I was actually listening to WeWork's recent call, and it seemed like their, you know, the latest financials and kind of just projections, that Delta was definitely putting a damper in terms of their overall demand. And so, you know, what I would say around co-working, the pandemic really highlighted the fact that you don't have those secure cash flows. And that's traditionally what you looked for in office, was that long-term cash flow, kind of trying to keep the tenants and keep it low capex. And again, going back to your overall basis, getting into a WeWork deal is very TI intensive. So if it doesn't work out, and you saw a lot of these landlords taking back space from there, they're able to release it maybe to a tech tenant, you know, best case scenario for those best located assets out there. But otherwise, you've built out the space to you know, specs that your traditional office tenant is not going to be able to afford from a rent perspective, and getting you there on return. So I do think that it's going to be office as a service, or kind of the operational aspect of it will be a larger part of the industry going forward. It's not going to go away. But I think there's probably going to be more sharing between the landlord and the operators on both kind of the downside and the upside, so that just creating a better alignment overall. It seems like right now, we work out of a lot of their leases, and it did leave landlords in a bad position in certain instances. And so, you don't want to rely 100% on short-term tenants, I would say, but it is going to be stick around to it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think there's some overriding theme here, which is that tenants are going to want some flexibility going forward, right? And so I do think that is going to be important as they build out their corporate portfolios. They may not always want 10 or 15-year leases. They might want some swing space, and they might want some space that they can pop up in pretty quickly or close down and shift to the needs of where their tenants are, depending on the demand. And how that manifests is going to be in a few different ways. There's going to be third-party providers, and there's going to be landlords sort of doing it as well. I mean, we have swing space floors on our office buildings where we can accommodate the growth, and we can do shorter-term spaces and help them kind of manage their tenants or their employee situation. We also have several third-party situations as well. So I think it's important. I think it's a piece of the puzzle overall. And I think that tenants are going to want some level of flexibility as they plan long term.
I'm gonna pose a question that's been asked for the other two panels. Lease renewals. What are you seeing around lease renewal activity? And is it different in these more niche sectors? How would you compare lease renewals in life science or medical office or creative office tenants, studio space, any of these? How would you compare those against more traditional office? And I'll start with you, Chad. I see you.
Yeah, it's exactly probably what you think on the life science and medical office stuff. Our renewals during COVID have been great. We've renewed tenants, we've pushed rents, there's a lot of momentum there, right? And so the supply demand is strong, and so we've had good situations. We have had in the traditional office, we've seen a little bit of everything, and it's varied by building and by market as well. So we have seen some downsizes, right? We've seen some 50,000 square foot tenants go to 30,000. That certainly happened, but then they'll sign for an additional 10 years. We've seen some tenants that have frankly grown and taken some more space, and we've seen some that have said, hey, I just want a year or a 3-year renewal, and we'll see, kind of a no TI renewal. So we have seen it's kind of run the gamut. There's a lot of haves and have-nots out there, and it varies widely by city and the type of office building that you've seen. But certainly the strength is in the life science part of it. We've been able to push rents aggressively and keep our renewals high.
Joe?
I agree with Chad, on the niche sectors of medical and life science, we haven't missed a beat. So that's a functional market for renewals. And we have transparency in where rents are based on the duration of the lease. We know it's a real lease. If you take traditional office, any traditional office we own, as we've talked about before, I'll be frank, that more than 60% of the deals that expire are probably, we've created a new category called kick the can. Is it a real lease, or is it a kick the can approach where the tenant says, I need 6 to 18 months to figure out what I want to do, and depending on the building, depending on the market, we're inclined to give them that time to kick the can and figure out what they need. And you can't force them into a position when you're not the landlord, are not in a position of strength. And so we're trying to work with our tenants so that we reach the right outcome at the end of the pandemic. And we know that some tenants are going to want to downsize. And so I have less transparency in markets like, let's take an example, Lower Manhattan. If you ask me, what is the net effective rate based on a real lease, a 5, 7, 10-year lease in Lower Manhattan right now, anyone who tells you that they know exactly where the market rent is for that location is lying to you. We're all trying to figure out what it is, and there are other urban locations and big buildings that are facing kind of that dilemma right now. So we have this panel next year. I'll hopefully have a better answer for you as to where rates are, and I think we'll have a more normal kind of renewal environment. But right now there's a lot of traditional office that's in limbo.
Yeah, I have a question in from the audience. when you underwrite niche opportunities, how do you think about holding period, exit strategy, and what return premium over traditional office do you need? Maybe I'll start off with Chad. So again, with these niche opportunities, holding period, exit strategy, and do you need any kind of return premium?
You know, it really varies on the risk profile of the deal. Core deals were generally, and we do core through development, value add and development. So we run the spectrum. Core deals, we're underwriting on kind of 10-year returns and 10-year holds. Value add deals, we want to look at on a 5-year hold, sometimes even less, on sort of what that looks like. So that part of the hold period doesn't change depending on whether it's niche or traditional. It really changes depending on what the business plan is and where it is in that risk spectrum. And then in terms of the return profile, you know, it's interesting. You might even say that the returns are sometimes less, like in some of the medical office deals that are very buttoned up right now and high credit and really good. The returns are very safe, durable. There's strong tailwinds. So you actually might accept, you know, let's say a 7% return, which if you're doing a traditional office, you might want an 8 or whatever it might be. So you're not always necessarily getting a premium to go into the alternative classes. There's been there's a lot of capital into it, and there's a lot of demand. But that said, you know, there should be long-term growth trends as well. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I'll go over to Joe.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Chad. It depends on the risk profile. If you're putting in value add, you know, it's a lot of any deals outside of niche aren't working. So, and then if you're looking at core and core plus, you know, I don't think we're looking at the return requirements any different. I might kind of morph the question a little bit around for niche, you know, how are we underwriting the future in terms of rent growth and absorption? Because that's where I think you got to be careful. There's a lot of strategies. A lot of folks are raising money for life science right now. There's a dearth of opportunities. And then there's kind of the shadow or gray area of how many buildings are going to get converted to life science or other niche product types. And so I would kind of ask the question of the group, and I'll answer it, which is, you know, are we betting that rent growth for life science will just continue to grow when we've seen such, you know, outsized rent growth over the past 5 years? You know, these non-credit life science tenants in Boston and San Francisco and San Diego, you know, are being forced to pay rents that are $70 to $110 a foot, triple net. And, you know, they have no credit and they're in research phase, and, you know, they're paying it because there's a scarcity of space available for them. But new supply is being created even in these markets, and conversions are happening. So again, I'm picking on life science, but what we're trying to do, and this relates to the return question, is to be very disciplined about our approach to rent growth and not assuming that, you know, rents are just going to continue to grow at these above average rates, but take the rents today. Hopefully, you know, we're investing in areas where we believe there's not going to be rent deflation, but kind of make our deals work based on, you know, based on kind of realistic kind of inflationary rent growth, hoping that the alpha creation is, you know, continues as it's been. And then it's just a question of, you know, the whole question around interest rates and what are exit cap rates going to be in 3, 5, 7, 10 years. You know, if there's any big risk to everything we're doing right now, is we're all assuming low interest rates and selling stabilized product at, you know, 4 to 6% cap rates, which I think is the right assumption. But, you know, that's definitely driving a lot of these returns as well.
And Andrew, your perspective?
Yeah, you know, from a niche to traditional, we consider we're looking for the best risk-adjusted returns regardless of where it's at. So we think about it from a dollar risk perspective of where you're putting your capital. I think, you know, don't know if I'm going to add anything from Chad or Joe, but what I would say in terms of office, you know, across the globe, because we also look at things in Europe and things in Asia. Europe's a little bit structurally different, where tenants are being kind of forced to go into spaces that are highly efficient from energy perspective, carbon, you know, there's carbon targets over there. There's a lot more of the onerous is being put on landlords and tenants there, to where Class A vacancy is extremely low, to A. You don't have as much of a regulatory push here, I think, in the US. And so, I think that's another point that I would make is just, you've seen certain legislation like the Congress just proposed doing things with vacant urban core assets in urban cities, and who knows how that pans out. But it essentially is proposed like the preservation program that they did as well. So, I think there's other regulatory pushes that could create opportunities within the sector too, beyond, just arriving at what the fundamentals might show you. There might be other reasons why rents grow further, just looking based on other geographies out there.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think we're coming up on our final 10 minutes. So I'm going to use this opportunity to go around to each of you for, sort of a key takeaway. I have asked this question of each panel, a key takeaway and what office investment strategy that you think offers an attractive risk-adjusted return. And so I think, why don't we start with Joe for this one?
I think my takeaway is, if I had to create a tagline from this, is niche is the new office. You want to own it because it's special, it's important. The idea of traditional office, if you sat down with my therapist and said, okay, Joe, what's the word that comes to mind, or two words that come to mind when you think traditional? I think commodity and obsolescence. So, niche is the new norm of what you've got to be focused on. And just because I'm expanding the category of niche to include, kind of that innovative oriented office environment, because it's not just the tech companies that want it, it's the banks and it's the insurance companies, and, and be prepared for some secular changes around how much space we actually need to satisfy these tenants on a per employee basis. I think that will continue to shrink. For a lot of companies, you got to look at it on an industry perspective, not just a market perspective. What types of tenants need this much space? What types of tenants don't? I'll give you a quick example. We're building a building in downtown Raleigh that's 50% pre-leased to a tech company. They can't wait to get into the building. My guess is they probably, will want more space, and they're calling us on a monthly basis. We've got another building somewhere in the US that is a brand new development for a fire sector tenant, not tech. And they've leased the whole building, but they did say to me, I'm not sure how much of that building I need. So those are two different industries and two different tenants on how they're looking at their space needs. So, be very particular around the locations, the buildings, and the tenant and the industries that are in them and in the location. The other, in terms of, what we like to invest into going forward, obviously niche is where we want to be, and we're most focused on life science and STEM oriented office. But I'll also say that I think one of the leading indicators on where you got to be focused on where to do that. And so, there's a very interesting migration pattern or demographic trend around a lot of these markets that we think will continue. Stronger population growth nodes. We kind of all know these markets. It's the Nashvilles, it's the Austins, it's Portland to a certain extent, but also the life science nodes of San Diego, RTP, and look back historically at, if you've been able to invest in some of these interesting higher secondary degree markets that are at the intersection of, an educated workforce and STEM employment. We've done some regression analysis going back to 1994 that proves if you can figure out where that intersection is occurring and growing, you can get ahead of opportunities to create value. And so that's what we're focused on is really figuring out where is the puck going in terms of market selection and micro locations, and making sure we're creating the right product in those locations.
Thanks. Chad?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just agree with most of what Joe just said in terms of sort of the expanding footprint and finding those kind of virtuous cycles, if you will, in some of these cities, because the demand is real. I think a takeaway is that some of these tenants are going to pay more for really high quality space. And so notwithstanding the comment about rent growth, it can't grow forever, but I do think that companies may say, hey, here's the footprint that we need, whether it's life science or office, and they're willing to pay a little bit more for the exact right product. So that's a takeaway that I see from this particular thing. And in terms of investment ideas or compelling investment themes, I have two. One is kind of new build. I just continue to think that tenants will move, traditional office tenants will move, they'll go towards highly stylized boutique office buildings. And I think sometimes that's going to be in the new build. If you look at the variations, if you look at occupancy and you look at leasing stats and you break them down by when they were built, it's staggering how the new build stuff is getting, the preponderance of the momentum. So that's one. And then another one, which is kind of a little bit different, but I'll toss it out there because I think it's a great investment thesis. If you go to these STEM-oriented markets that we've been talking about, that have the highly educated workforce, et cetera, and you buy kind of one-story infill flex product, you can sit on the income of the flex, or you can convert it to some lab higher spec stuff over time. You can get current cash flow in the meantime, and you can take conversion, and you know that the city has long-term growth trends as well. So that's a risk-adjusted return profile investment thesis that we like.
And Andrew.
Yeah. I think the key takeaway for me is to remain focused on the assets that core buyers want to buy, where you're creating that long-term durable cash flow for them. And I think you do that by focusing on those growth industries, the media, the life sciences, the studio space, and really deliver underlying buildings that meet the tenants' needs and where they can themselves grow and do whatever they need to do in a very specialized space. And there's a specific reason for them to be located in this building. So that's kind of where we see the opportunities.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Joe. This panel was looking at, niche alternatives within the office sector. It sounds like there's a lot of excitement around life science, medical office, studio space, the whole gamut of alternative office uses. Again, thank you guys for joining us, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Now I'd like to introduce and bring back Jeffrey Dorman, who will kind of take us away and give us some final closing thoughts. So thank you.
Well, first I'd like to thank all the panelists and the sponsors. I think the panelists did a phenomenally good job of bringing us up to speed on an area that's obviously undergoing a great deal of change in terms of what the demand drivers are, and yet my biggest takeaway, I've been listening to office presentations for 43 years. So over that time, you don't hear an awful lot that's new. So this was very refreshing. So it's fun to listen to. One of the takeaways is, my goodness, there's an old saying that there's a million stories in the naked city. Well, there's also a million stories in the secondary cities and the niche nodes and all sorts of other things. So, and stories are part of what make markets. And the fact that there are some different viewpoints between the panelists, I thought was fascinating. You listen to the panels, and within the panels, there was a lot of agreement, but there wasn't a lot of panels when you really dissect it between the panels, other than perhaps locational issues that almost everybody seems to agree on. So that was interesting and fascinating. But where the winners are going to be and where the losers are going to be, you've all listened to the same thing I've listened to. It's really up to you to decide who you agree with and where you think the winners long-term are going to be. The other thing to keep in mind is some of the panelists were focused on where real opportunity is to get higher rents and higher valuations. Others were more focused on what is going to be lasting in terms of stability of cash flows over time. They weren't looking for higher cash flows. They were looking for more stable, sustainable cash flows over time. You could argue that the later panelists were arguing that you're going to get those kind of things in these niche strategies. But it's certainly plausible amongst the others to say that the gateway cities are still going to be dominant. Places like New York are still going to be, global financial centers and still be attractive to employers. And again, I thought one of the more interesting things I heard in favor of those markets was that if you want to earn a New York wage, you got to be in a New York office building. That was kind of interesting. So again, fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed all three panels. I thought they each took a different perspective, a different angle on things. I'd like to compliment you, Loretta, for a great job in moderating. And John, what a wonderful job you did of putting together these panels, both in terms of finding the speakers and in terms of, helping them curate the content for this discussion. And also should thank Randy for helping attract the sponsors to this program. really, really interesting stuff. Thanks for listening in, and thanks for joining us, and we'll see you at the next IREI Live. Take care, everybody. Bye.